The Equites constituted the lower of the two aristocratic classes of ancient Rome, ranking below the patricians, a hereditary caste that monopolized political power during the regal era and during the early republic. A member of the equestrian order was known as an eques. During the Roman kingdom and the first century of the Republic, legionary cavalry was recruited exclusively from the ranks of the patricians, who were expected to provide 6th century of cavalry. Around 400 BC, 12 more century of cavalry were established, and these included non-patricians. Around 300 BC, the Samnite Wars obliged Rome to double the normal annual military levy from 2 to 4 legions, doubling the cavalry levy from 600 to 1,200 horses. Legionary cavalry started to recruit wealthier citizens from outside the 18th century. These new recruits came from the first class of commoners in the centuriate organization and were not granted the same privileges. By the time of the Second Punic War, all the members of the first class of commoners were required to serve as cavalrymen. The presence of equites in the Roman cavalry diminished steadily in the period 200–88 BC, as only equites could serve as the army's senior officers. As the number of legions proliferated, fewer were available for ordinary cavalry service. After c. 88 BC, equites were no longer drafted into the legionary cavalry, although they remained technically liable to such service throughout the Principate era. They continued to supply the senior officers of the army throughout the Principate. With the exception of the purely hereditary patricians, the equites were originally defined by a property threshold. The rank was passed from father to son. Although members of the order who at the regular quinquennial census no longer met the property requirement were usually removed from the order's rolls by the Roman censors. In the late Republic, the property threshold stood at 50,000 denarii and was doubled to 100,000 by the Emperor Augustus, roughly the equivalent to the annual salaries of 450 contemporary legionaries. In the later Republican period, Roman senators and their offspring became an unofficial elite within the equestrian order, as senators' ability to engage in commerce was strictly limited by law. The bulk of non-agricultural activities were in the hands of non-senatorial equites. As well as holding large landed estates, equites came to dominate mining, shipping and manufacturing industry. In particular, tax farming companies were almost all in the hands of equites. Under Augustus, the senatorial elite was given formal status with a higher wealth threshold and superior rank and privileges to ordinary equites. During the Principate, equites filled the senior administrative and military posts of the imperial government. There was a clear division between jobs reserved for senators and those reserved for non-senatorial equites. But the career structure of both groups was broadly similar. A period of junior administrative posts in Rome or Italy, followed by a period of military service as a senior army officer, followed by senior administrative or military posts in the provinces. Senators and equites formed a tiny elite of under 10,000 members who monopolized political, military and economic power in an empire of about 60 million inhabitants. During the 3rd century AD, power shifted from the Italian aristocracy to a class of equites who had earned their membership by distinguished military service, often rising from the ranks. Career military officers from the provinces who displaced the Italian aristocrats in the top military posts, and undid Diocletian from the top civilian positions also. This effectively reduced the Italian aristocracy to an idle, but immensely wealthy group of large landowners. During the 4th century, the status of equites was debased to insignificance by excessive grants of the rank. At the same time, the ranks of senators was swollen to over 4,000 by the establishment of a second senate in Constantinople and the tripling of the membership of both senates. The senatorial order of the 4th century was thus the equivalent of the equestrian order of the Principate. Regal era. According to Roman legend, Rome was founded by its first king, Romulus, in 753 BC. However, archaeological evidence suggests that Rome did not acquire the character of a unified city-state until California, 625 BC. Roman tradition relates that the Order of Knights was founded by Romulus, who supposedly established a cavalry regiment of 300 men called the Celeres to act as his personal escort, with each of the 3 Roman tribes supplying 100 horse. This cavalry regiment was supposedly doubled in size to 600 men by King Tarquinius Priscus. That the cavalry was increased to 600 during the regal era is plausible, as in the early Republic the cavalry fielded remained 600 strong. However, according to Livy, King Servius Tullius established a further 12 century of Equites, a further tripling of the cavalry. But this is probably anachronistic, as it would have resulted in a contingent of 1,800 horse, incongruously large, compared to the heavy infantry, which was probably only 6,000 strong in the late regal period. Instead, the additional 12 century were probably created at a later stage, perhaps around 400 BC, but these new units were political, not military, most likely designed to admit plebeians to the Order of Knights. Apparently, Equites were originally provided with a sum of money by the state to purchase a horse for military service and for its fodder. This was known as an equus publicus. Mommsen argues that the royal cavalry was drawn exclusively from the ranks of the patricians, the aristocracy of early Rome, which was purely hereditary. Apart from the traditional association of the aristocracy with horsemanship, the evidence for this view is the fact that, during the Republic, 6th century of Equites in the Comitia Centuriata retained the names of the original 6 royal cavalry centuri. These are very likely the centuri of patrician nobles, in the Comitia mentioned by the lexicologist Festus. If this view is correct, it implies that the cavalry was exclusively patrician in the regal period. Early Republic. It is widely accepted that the Roman monarchy was overthrown by a patrician coup, probably provoked by the Tarquin dynasty's populist policies in favor of the plebeian class. Indeed, Alfolda suggests that the coup was carried out by the Celeres themselves. According to the Fraccaro interpretation, when the Roman monarchy was replaced by 2 annually elected praetors, the royal army was divided equally between them for campaigning purposes, which if true explains why a later Polybian legion's cavalry contingent was 300 strong. The 12 additional centuri ascribed by Livy to Servius Tullius were in reality probably formed around 400 BC. In 403 BC, according to Livy, in a crisis during the siege of Eri, the army urgently needed to deploy more cavalry, and those who possessed equestrian rating but had not yet been assigned public horses volunteered to pay for their horses out of their own pocket. By way of compensation, pay was introduced for cavalry service, as it had already been for the infantry. The persons referred to in this passage were probably members of the 12 new centuri who were entitled to public horses, but temporarily waived that privilege. Mommsen, however, argues that the passage refers to members of the first class of commoners being admitted to cavalry service in 403 BC for the first time as an emergency measure. If so, this group may be the original so-called Equites Equo Privata, a rank that is attested throughout the history of the Republic. However, due to lack of evidence, the origins and definition of Equo Privator or Equites remain obscure. It is widely agreed that the 12 new centuri were open to non-patricians. Thus, from this date if not earlier, not all Equites were patricians. The patricians, as a closed hereditary caste, steadily diminished in numbers over the centuries, as families died out. Around 450 BC, there are some 50 patrician gentes recorded, whereas just 14 remained at the time of Julius Caesar, whose own Lulii clan was patrician. In contrast, the ranks of Equites, although also hereditary, were open to new entrants who met the property requirement and who satisfied the Roman censors that they were suitable for membership. As a consequence, patricians rapidly became only a small minority of the equestrian order. However, patricians retained political influence greatly out of proportion with their numbers. Until 172 BC, one of the two consuls elected each year had to be a patrician. In addition, patricians may have retained their original 6th century, which gave them a third of the total voting power of the Equites. Even though they constituted only a tiny minority of the order by 200 BC, patricians also enjoyed official precedence, such as the right to speak first in senatorial debates, which were initiated by the princeps senatus, a position reserved for patricians. In addition, patricians monopolized certain priesthoods and continued to enjoy enormous prestige.